Hello everyone, welcome back to Accounting is Easy PH. Last video, we have learned the rules of debits and credits. Today, we will go deeper with the transactions in which the rules of debits and credits will apply. Today, we will be learning the transactions which involves the use of asset. I'm Coach Mark and I'll be your guide throughout this course. So, we have three objectives for this day. First is to review the rules of debits and credits which you have learned on the previous video. Second, to know the transactions involving the use of assets. And lastly, of course, to journalize the transactions involving the use of asset. So let us recap the rules of debits and credits. We all know that the assets, expenses, and drawings all have a normal balance of debit, which means that if they are going to be increased, they should be debited. Now, on the other hand, the income or revenue, liabilities, and capital all have a normal balance of credit, which means if they're increased, they will be credited. Now, how do we decrease these accounts? So just take the opposite. If we're going to decrease the asset, expenses, and drawings, you need to credit it. And if you're going to decrease the income or revenue, liability or capital, we're going to debit it. So we are done with our first objective, which is the review of the rules of debits and credits. Now, let us proceed to our objective number 2, which is to know the transactions involving the use of asset. Now, before we go deeper, let us now define first use of asset. It is a transaction in which the asset is being decreased with the corresponding decrease on either liability or equity or both. Going back to our accounting equation, which is asset is equal to liability plus owner's equity, the asset is being decreased with the corresponding decrease on liability or owner's equity or both. So let's now have an example. Our first example is the payment of accounts payable. Let us bring back our accounting equation. So here, payment of accounts payable. Now, if we're going to pay a liability, what shall we give up? Of course, cash. Therefore, our asset will now be decreased. And then, since we paid up our accounts payable, our liability will now decrease also. So have you noticed that the asset, specifically the cash, is being used to pay a liability? That is use of asset. Second example, owner withdrawal. So the company will now be paying the owner. Now, bringing back our accounting equation, we have the asset will be decreased because of course the owner will withdraw some cash or non-cash asset from the company with a corresponding decrease on the owner's equity. So therefore, if we're going to summarize the transaction, the asset is being used to pay the owner. Use of asset. And lastly, our third example, payment of rent expense. Let us go back to our accounting equation. Asset is equal to liability plus owner's equity. We all know that an expense is an owner's equity element and it negates the balance of our owner's equity. Therefore, if the expense is increased, it has a corresponding decrease on our owner's equity. Now, payment of rent expense are going to pay. Therefore, our asset will be decreased. with a corresponding decrease on owner's equity. So therefore, in short, the asset is being used to pay the expenses. Now, we are done with our second objective. Let us now proceed to our third objective, which is to familiarize ourselves with the journal entries involving the use of assets. So, going back to our first example, which is the payment of accounts payable, how do we journalize this? Now, remember that the asset is being decreased and our liability is also decreased. Now, our liability has a normal balance of credit. Therefore, if we're going to decrease our liability, it must be debited. So we need to debit the accounts payable. And since our asset is being decreased and it has a normal balance of debit, we will now credit our asset. So therefore, our journal entry is debit, accounts payable, credit, cash for the payment of accounts payable. Second, owner withdrawal. Let us now decrease our owner's equity by debiting owner withdrawing account and crediting cash for the amount. And lastly, payment of rent expense. So we need to increase our expense. And that increase in expense is tantamount to a decrease in owner's equity. So debit the rent expense, then credit cash or non-cash asset. So now we are done. With our three objectives, which are the review of the rules of debits and credits, knowing the transactions involving the use of asset, and lastly, the journal entries involving the use of assets. Now, before I sign off, let me give you a simple hint on how to ace journal entries involving use of asset. Now, remember that in transactions involving the use of asset, the asset account is always on the credit side. Just remember that, so that after you analyze and determine that a certain transaction is a use of asset, you will automatically credit the asset account. So I hope that you find this video useful in your studies. Good luck, friends, and please do like our Facebook page, Accounting is Easy PH, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Accounting is Easy PH. Again, this is Coach Mark, and God bless us all.